I think we can probably get started. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Sarah McKinney. I'm the Faculty Director of Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies. And I'm very excited to be presenting our guest speaker for today, who's actually a Tinker visiting professor with us this semester in Education Policy Studies, is that correct?
Yes.
Great. Professor Luis Gandin holds a degree in social sciences and a master's degree in sociology from Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which you received in 2002. Professor Gandin's research is in the field of education and has an emphasis in sociology of education. And his work really examines a number of topics, including education policy, curriculum, education reform, and the Citizen School Project, which I believe we're going to hear a little bit about today. He's also been a professor in a number of prestigious universities around the world, including Stanford and the University and the University of Cambridge. And so we here at the University of Wisconsin are in good company in inviting him as a visiting scholar. So I'm very excited to hear this talk, and I hand the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. And I want to start thanking LACES for being here. If it wasn't for LACES, I wouldn't be here. And of course, the Tinker Foundation as well. But I know that the efforts of LACES to bring me here were what actually made the difference. And I also want to thank and acknowledge the Department of Educational Policy Studies that also proposed my coming here. And I'm teaching a class that is cross-listed with LACES and Educational Policy Studies, which has been wonderful. So I want to really thank you for being here. So my talk here today is about a research project that I have been involved since the year 2000, perhaps, so a lot of time. And I've been coming back to this research because I think it's really important, and it's really the experience of the Citizen School project in Porto Alegre is worth studying. It's worth understanding what are the principles that guided that reform in the city of Porto Alegre. And so what I'll do today is I'll present some of the principles that guided the educational reform back in Porto Alegre, but also I'm going to be going through some of the theoretical framework that I constructed to analyze this particular experience. So as you can see, Porto Alegre is the capital of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, in the southernmost state of Brazil. A lot of people tell us that we're not really Brazilian, we're most close to Uruguay and Argentina, and we feel proud of that as well, of course. But we drink mate like the Argentinians and Uruguayans. So Porto Alegre is an interesting city, and as I'll tell you, it's a city with a lot of history. So how do I approach this research and the Citizen School project? First of all, I think we should start by saying that the agenda for social justice a lot of times focuses on what's preventing social justice, which is great, right? So we should truly focus on diagnosis and critique, but I don't think this is enough. We need a little more than this. And just across the street here, there was someone who actually created a project, Eric Olin-Wright, called the Real Utopias Project. It was part of this idea of that we should also focus on the ways that social justice has been concretely promoted around the world. So not only focusing on what impedes social justice, but also in what creates possibilities, right? And in this way, what I'm doing is acting as a secretary. Michael Apple, who's here, thank you very much for being here, Professor Apple. Wayne Au and I, in the introduction of the Routledge Handbook of Critical Education, We talked about this idea of acting as a secretary, of documenting, of making sure that the information is available as wide as possible of these transformations that are being increased in the world, are being done in the world. And highlighting the Rio Utopia project actually follows the tradition of Paulo Freire as well, the Brazilian educator. He says that our job as scholars and activists is to have hope, but he talks about hope in a very interesting way. The word hope in Portuguese is esperanza, same in Spanish. But he says a lot of time people think that hope, esperanza, is esperar, to wait, and not to esperanzar, which is actually a verb, to actually do something about it. So hope is not something that you wait for, something that you join others to do differently. That's what Paulo Freire used to say. And I think this is the sort of the tradition that I'm trying to follow here in sociology of education and in critical education studies. Even before I start talking to you about some of the changes that Porto Alegre created, I just wanted to point out something, the way that Porto Alegre sort of started this change. Educational policy and practices have been sort of doing the same things in different ways all around the world. We've been trying to promote education reform for as long as we know, but doing the same thing over and over and expecting different outcomes is actually the definition of insanity. And I think we have a lot of insanity in educational reform in the world. So what I think we should be doing is asking different questions, because the kinds of questions that are being asked sort of lead us to the kind of answers that are being answered. And in the tradition of critical education, and Professor Michael Apple, who's here, is one of the people that actually promoted this idea in sociology of education and critical curriculum theory. We shouldn't be asking only questions of how, because a lot of the times in education, we only ask questions of how. Let's change methodologies, let's introduce technology, let's do this kinds of stuff. But we also should be asking the questions of what, why, and for whom. So the problem in education is not only a technical one, although it is also a technical one, it's methodological, of course, but it's also a theoretical and ontological problem. And the other problem is that a lot of experiences that cater for the poor in the world for education, they are a mere compensatory approach that sort of gives, sort of redistributes official knowledge, tries to do it at least, in a way that believes that by redistributing knowledge, we will achieve social justice. What Porto Alegre did is to ask a completely different questions. Who's education serving now? Whose knowledge is being taught? And then they started responding with a very concrete way in a completely different educational system. And I think this is very important. So let's contextualize a little bit what the Citizen School Project in Porto Alegre is. Porto Alegre, first of all, is a city of a lot of historical social movements. And this is important to say because in 1989, when the proposal started, we were coming from a dictatorship, a civil military dictatorship. And social movements meant a very different thing at that particular moment in Brazil. So there was a lot of mothers' associations for fighting inflation. So a lot of people tended to not to see those as social movements. And what the Workers' Party and a lot of social movements started to understand is that created spaces for people to operate during times where actual political mobilizations were not allowed during the dictatorship. So this is a very important part. And Porto Alegre has a very long tradition of these kinds of movements. The other thing is that you should know is that, so concretely, in 1989, coalitions of parties led by the Workers' Party won the election, and they were re-elected 3 times. So they stayed in power for 16 long years. And that's when the Citizen School Project started to be implemented. The educational project was only one part of the larger project for the transformation of the city of Porto Alegre, and that's very important to know. You probably heard of the participatory budgeting, which participatory budgeting is the structure of involving citizens in the decisions of how public money will be allocated. And as a matter of fact, Eric Wright lists the participatory budget as one of Rio Utopia's projects in his books. And Porto Alegre is a city where that all started. By the way, if you look, even today, there are a lot of cities in the US that are implementing participatory budgeting. And take a look, it's very interesting. They all follow the Porto Alegre model. Mm-hmm. The other thing you should know is that the schools that I'm going to be talking about, they're all in the most impoverished areas of Porto Alegre. Some areas that didn't even have schools before the Citizen School Project started. And the final point that I wanted you to know is that at that particular time in Brazil and all over the world, actually, neoliberal policies were being pushed. And that's very important because this kinds of ideas of decentralization, competition, blaming teachers, testing, was the sort of the context in which the proposal started. And that's very important to know as well. Okay, so how do I understand the context in which the Citizen School Project was created? First of all, I think that memory of social mobilizations that I just told you about was crucial. The idea that gathering together to construct this collective decisions is a crucial part of the way society should work, actually tends to sort of bleed into the educational system by creating the kinds of mechanisms that allow this. The other thing that I think it's crucial to understand is that neoliberal policies and all hegemonic policies or hegemonic powers are never only implemented and that's it, right? There's always struggles, there's always contradictions. And what Porto Alegre did, the city of Porto Alegre did, was to explore sort of these contradictions. And what I've been claiming using Stuart Hall's work is that what they did was sort of a very interesting work of disarticulation of some of these concepts, of neoliberal concepts, and a rearticulation of the same ideas to completely different ideas. Later on, we will talk about some of these concepts. For example, decentralization, right? Or even the word citizen that is so crucial for this project. When you think about the word citizen, it's very depoliticized in many ways, right? But in the particular context in which Porto Alegre was creating the Citizen School Project, the idea of citizenship was sort of a weapon against the idea of consumerism that was starting to be prevalent in the sort of language about education. So using the word citizenship or using the word democracy, which was at that particular moment crucial to define what participation should look like. Remember, we were coming from a dictatorship, was very crucial. So this process of disarticulation and rearticulation was something that Porto Alegre did very well in that particular moment. The other thing that I should say is that a lot of times either coming from the right or from the left, there's a temptation of saying, okay, we know what to do. Let's just change education and we know what to do. And we, as people in charge, right? We will come with a grand plan and you will implement it, right? What Porto Alegre tried to do is to sort of challenge that idea. And they said, and remember, this is important to know, they were sort of fighting the idea of sort of a vanguard in a way at that particular moment, the traditions within the left, and they were saying the experiences of neighborhood associations, of theology of liberation, community organizations, taught us that democracy is the way to go. So rather than coming up with the principles and making you implement them, let's all create the principles that will guide our reforms. And so they started doing a long process of 18 months of meetings with community organizations, schools, teachers, the parents, students. They all gathered together and started to trying to understand what should we be doing with the educational system of the city of Porto Alegre. And later on, this culminated with a 700 delegate conference that then designated the guiding principles. And these principles were three. They decided that democracy was a key word, but democracy had to be achieved by doing three things, they said. First of all, access. Remember, I told you there was a lot of people that were not served by schools in the most impoverished areas. So access was crucial. Democratization of governance structures was crucial as well. You cannot do a democratic reform if you have very sort of bureaucratic structures that impede your way of participation. And also they said we need democratization of knowledge. Remember, they started by asking not how should we make official knowledge get into lives of everybody, but what knowledge are we teaching in these classrooms? Whose knowledge is not being taught? So democratization of knowledge was also crucial in this particular reform. So one of the things that they first started was building schools, and building schools were done a lot of in connection with the participatory budgeting structures of the city. So the communities would gather together and say, listen, we don't have a school here. So the communities will prioritize the idea of constructing schools in those particular areas. And the other thing for access is that the dropout rates were incredibly high. So Brazil at that particular point was not even at 100% of kids at the regular age entering school. But a lot of the kids were actually dropping out, like third grade, fourth grade, because they were failing and then dropping out. So that was something that had to be addressed. You cannot construct a democratic educational system where kids are not part of it, where they're dropping out. So they realized that. The other thing is that they understood is that they needed a new governance culture in schools, a culture of participation, and I'll come to those concepts of redistribution and recognition very soon. So they needed new institutional mechanisms. They needed to create, those of you who are in sociology perhaps know that sociologists a lot of times struggle with the idea of transformations. And the idea is that, should we transform first cultures or structures, right? And they sort of said, we should do both. Let's do both at the same time. Let's create a new culture, but also allowing this new culture to flourish by developing new structures that support this new culture of participation. So that was a very important part. And also in terms of curriculum, I'm going to go through this very soon. But there's also a decision that was crucial, and I think we should highlight that, In a time where teachers were being attacked, Porto Alegre tripled the salaries of teachers. And for many, many years, one of the best salaries in the public schools in the whole country was in Porto Alegre. So, and hiring new teachers, having supporting staff was crucial, a crucial decision, as also something that was done. So, you know, in terms of democratization of access to school, these are some numbers for you to understand. So almost tripled the number of schools, which is crucial. And before you think this is very low numbers of schools, Porto Alegre is a very complicated system of state schools and municipal schools. These are only city-wide schools, municipal schools. So we're talking about municipal schools here. And the dropout rate that I told you about was dramatically reduced. It wasn't eliminated because education cannot change society by itself, but it was very reduced. And the other thing that they did in terms of democratization of access was that a lot of the kids were dropping out because they were failing repeatedly. And so, for example, you would have a 14-year-old in a class of 9-year-olds because this person repeated so many times the years. And so they decided to reorganize the whole structure of school years by cycles of formation, they call it. And there are other countries that do this. Portugal, for example, Spain do this, but they did it in a very sort of different way where you would not fail. So the cycles were 3 cycles of 3 years each. We're talking about elementary and middle school here. And so 3 years of 3 cycles of 3 years each. And kids would progress inside those cycles and be evaluated in their learning, but not fail, which was crucial for them. But the evaluation process was very important. In terms of school governance, I think it's crucial to mention a couple of things. First of all, they had to democratize the Department of Education inside out. Remember, we were coming from the dictatorship. Bureaucracies were very sort of top down. I make the joke, which is not really a joke, that in Porto Alegre before this, you had to apply to the mayor if you wanted to buy a pencil in a school. So centralized the system was. So creating a new system inside the Department of Education was crucial. The Municipal Congress of Education, that one that I described that decided on the principles, was scheduled to run every 4 years. So every 4 years, they would reevaluate all the goals and the achievements. School councils, which now sounds like very sort of very bread and butter, but at that point was something very revolutionary, that having parents and students and staff and teachers making the decisions of how schools operate was very, very different at that particular moment. The other thing, direct election of principals and pedagogical coordinators. The communities elect the principals. Now in Brazil, almost all public schools do it. Porto Alegre was the first systems to start that. And of course, I told you about the bureaucracy, so redistribution of funds and a participatory budgeting inside the school as well, which was crucial. In terms of democratization of knowledge, what they did was, of course, first change the structure of how education was working in the schools. For example, the school curriculum was before very centralized, and from now on, school curriculum was going to be constructed inside the school by the community. And for every year, at the beginning of the year, teachers would go and gather, do an actual research in the communities to understand what are some of the issues that these communities are facing. And then they would come back to schools and plan the curriculum accordingly. So they would put their expertise, let's say you're a chemistry teacher or a math teacher, you will put your expertise. So your expertise is very important, but it will serve the particular theme that the community decided is important. So you're still learning chemistry, you're still learning math, but you're learning it through as a way of understanding the world in which you are, and you're sort of understanding how to transform it as well through those tools, right? The other thing that I find fascinating is the learning laboratories. A lot of times learning laboratories are very common, but learning laboratories in Porto Alegre were not only for the kids, but they were also for the teachers. Learning laboratories sometimes are, well, you have a kid that is falling behind, so you want some help, this kid goes there. The idea here is that, okay, this kid is falling behind, you come to the learning laboratory and teachers will sort of understand what are they doing that could change the way this kid is learning. So learning laboratories are not only for students, they are for teachers as well. So rather than blaming the victim, you sort of assume that if the kid is not learning, there's something wrong with the school, what the school is doing. And that's a very interesting idea, I think. And the other thing that you have to understand, these are very poor communities, and the schools are the only public building all over the place. This is where kids can come to play. This is where kids, the community organizations can come to have their meetings, because that's the only public building around. And so schools sort of become this cultural nodes where you sort of also cultural manifestations of the communities start to use those spaces as theirs. And I think one of the things that is very interesting here, that a lot of, as you know, a lot of times schools are destroyed or by the kids, or in a sort of a protest. You know, you see a lot of broken stuff and glass, and you see that a lot in Brazil. These schools are never destroyed because these kids know that this is their space and their family. So that's a very interesting way. Also, if you want to ask later on, the architecture is completely different as well. The classrooms are done in a way that you can do sort of different configurations, and so it's really an interesting way of constructing. So I want to spend. I know I'm going. This is a long talk, but I really want to talk a little bit about this because I think these are some of the frameworks that help us understand what's going on there in terms of what knowledge is going on. So Paulo Freire is known for his generative themes, right? So Paulo Freire would do a lot of literacy classes by generative themes, right? So knowledge that comes from the students. So the idea here was to go a step further. You're not only learning from your students, but you're learning from your communities as well. So from communities or organizations and this kind of things. But the other thing that I find fascinating is that a lot of times, as I said before, the idea of compensatory education thinks that you do good for these kids if you teach them the official knowledge, right? And that's important, of course. But what Paulo Freire teaches us is that this could be done in a very different way, because in a lot of times when you're teaching kids this is the right way of speaking Portuguese, you're telling them that the way they speak is an ugly way or not a very valid way, which couldn't be farther from the truth, because it works in that community, and it makes them communicate very well. So the idea is not giving one knowledge and taking another away, but it's sort of making these two different kinds of knowledge rub against each other and make them create new kinds of knowledge. And that, I think, it's very Freirean in its conception, right? But I think in the US context, there's the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings, who was a professor here, retired not many years ago. And her idea of what is it called? The culturally relevant pedagogy, right? I think Gloria will tell you that she read Paulo Freire and she bases some of the ideas of her work in Paulo Freire as well. So yes, we need academic achievement, but we also need cultural competence. We need people that are able to operate within their own culture, and we need political critique. And so I think that's an interesting way. And the other thing that I find interesting is that Boaventura de Souza Santos has this idea of an ecology of knowledge and what he calls a double epistemological rupture, which is you have to overcome common sense, but you don't overcome common sense saying that science has all the answers. You put this common sense and science on scrutiny, and you understand where they're coming from. And I think that idea is very interesting. And of course, Professor Michael Apples says that usually for the poor, we only have instrumental knowledge, right? You're poor, you need to work. I'll give you this knowledge that you can have a job with. A lot of abstract knowledge is only reserved for middle classes and the elites. Here, the idea was to combine practical knowledge and abstract knowledge, because abstract knowledge makes you able to understand the world as well, right? I think I'm going to go for the why I think Porto Alegre is relevant to study. And I have several points here that I've been defending that I think show you why I think Porto Alegre is an example for us to study. Not to copy or not to model after it, but to understand the principles that guide the idea, right? So first of all, one thing that we have to understand is that at that particular juncture in society, having a local state that supports this reform was crucial. If you have a neoliberal context in the country, a push towards national tasks, and that was the first time in Brazil they were talking about national tasks and implementing national tasks. The government of Porto Alegre said, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. We're simply not going to do it. We are doing our assessment. We're testing our students, but we're not doing this study for the test or test that only understands if you memorized some kind of knowledge. So what I've been defending is that the local government sort of provided a sort of a protection against those national policies that were being created. And I think this is interesting to understand. It's very localized in this particular context, but I think it's worth understanding that was operating there. The other thing that I find fascinating is that the experience of Porto Alegre was not only participatory in the implementation of the policy, which a lot of reforms are, but also in the creation of the policy. So gathering people together to create principles was very sort of revolutionary at that particular moment, particularly in the tradition of the left in Brazil that usually had all the answers for the reforms. And so having that idea that you have to learn from the people who are actually struggling on the context, right? Was a very important lesson, I think, that we can learn. So democracy matters. The other thing is that, yes, Porto Alegre was interested in students' inclusion in academic success, of course, because that's important. But they understood that academic success doesn't come only from drilling content, right? So memorizing stuff or giving even more of the tasks or the traditional content. So as I told you, because knowledge was very linked to lived experiences, because knowledge was part of a tool to understand the world in which you're living, it was possible for students actually to learn official knowledge and incorporate it as an extra layer of understanding about the world, but doing it in a way that doesn't expel their own knowledge or the community's knowledge or the community's experiences. And I think this is what Raymond Connell calls curricular justice. This idea of putting the interest of the least advantaged central in the curriculum, not in the periphery, not giving you 1 day or 1 month, but changing curriculum to the core to incorporate the worldview from the ones who are being oppressed. And the other thing is that curriculum was specific to each school, which makes it very, very connected to the experience of those schools. I told you about the state, yes, but remember, this particular people who were in the state, they were themselves trade unionists, they were community organizers, and they were part of the mobilization from from civil society. And so the idea of not only relying on the state, but having a pressure of social movements, sort of making you honest, was something that Porto Alegre was very good about doing. So what I sort of claim here is that the state was being educated by social movements. Not only the state is educating students and communities, but the state is being educated by the developments and the organizations of the communities. The other thing is that they understood that teachers were incredibly important, and there's no successful reform without teachers being involved, and salaries being increased and conditions of work being increased. So these teachers have conditions, actual material conditions, to create the whole proposal. And I think that's another aspect that is crucial. Another point, there's a lot of ideas of compensatory education that only focus on the idea of deficit, that you're sort of filling a hole when you go to an impoverished community. These people have nothing, we have to give them stuff, right? So what they did here was to problematize this idea and to not to work as education as a deficit filler, but education as an experience that can bring up knowledge from the communities and make them central to the learning process. And I think that's another point that is crucial in that particular experiences. These two last ones, the educational reform was part of a citywide reform, which is, I think it's crucial. It was not only education, but it was participatory budgeting. It was a lot of other structures going on in the city. Creating transportation was a huge reform that was done with public buses and things like that. And the final point that I make is that Porto Alegre sort of provided a new social imaginary as well for us in education. As you probably know, the World Social Forum was first held in Porto Alegre and was held there for many, many years. And the World Education Forum was also held in Porto Alegre. So that idea of sort of becoming a safe haven for the ones who are sort of understanding and trying to create reform, progressive reform around the world, and providing this example of a place where it's possible, the real utopia, if you will, right? It's a crucial thing as well. So this is important, creating social imaginaries. And finally, I want to end. I started with real utopias, and I want to end with utopias again. This is Zizek gave this talk in Argentina, I think, and he was talking about, I don't know exactly what, but his idea was to talk about utopia. And I think this quote, I'll give you a little time to read, and I think this quote is really interesting. For some people, there's only reality, and reality is good because it's status quo. But if you're impoverished, if you're oppressed, there's only utopia for you. So utopia is not, it's a matter of survival. And I think the way he talks about it, it's very interesting. The future will be utopian or there will be none. So the idea that if we want to think about educational reform has to be utopian. It cannot continue to reproduce status quo. And I think Porto Alegre represents a good example of a place where that was done. Thank you very much.